Welcome to Justice Talks. This is the podcast where we talk about using trauma informed practices to inform criminal justice system reform. My name is Dr. Lori Hall, and I am joined today by two guests. If y'all want to introduce yourselves.
I'm Lauren Richard. I'm an English major student here at USF, and I'm very excited to be here.
Hi, I'm Carrie Hopkins-Isles, and I'm a visiting instructor in the criminology department as well as a certified addictions professional.
Awesome. So today the topic is drugs.
Drugs.
Love some drugs, right? So we're talking about drugs within the context of use of drugs and abuse of drugs in an avoidant culture, right? So we're really kind of trying to talk about understanding escapism and why people kind of resort to the use of drugs and what we may mean when we say drugs. So we're really using this as like a catch-all term, right? So we're talking about substances. So these are things like illegal drugs, illicit drugs, prescription drug use. We're talking about alcohol. We're talking about food, right? But we're also talking about some like maladaptive behaviors. So can you give us some examples of what we mean when we say maladaptive behaviors?
Absolutely. So this is an area that I've been researching more and more because I started as just thinking about drugs and alcohol when I was helping with treatment. But now I'm realizing, gambling,
Right.
Sex, food, as you mentioned, even just risky behaviors in general. There are people who are addicted to just constantly doing things that are risky
Like thrill
and dangerous. Yes.
Yeah.
So gaming, that's a huge one. And our kids are really vulnerable to that right now.
Pornography.
Oh, yes.
Like the consumption of.
Absolutely.
That would definitely, I think, fall in there.
Yep. And internet addiction in general, smartphone, that just sort of scrolling through and numbing yourself, not doing something intentionally, not, I'm looking up this thing or I'm playing this game or watching this video, but just sort of generally scrolling, as you said, to be avoidant of whatever it is you're feeling or going through.
Yeah. So when we talk about drugs, and we're really talking about substances on this really large scale, as anything that we're using to avoid something, right? And so I guess the something is the elephant in the room. That's the thing that we're really trying to get at here. And I think for the work that I do, largely that something is trauma, right? We're trying to avoid these things that are really, really difficult and hard for us to handle, and successfully process and integrate into our memory systems so that we can move through those. And I think that is the thing that has been probably the most debilitating thing for us as humans in our experiences. And I like that you bring up intentionality, because I think that that's the juxtaposition between escapism, right? So we're talking about how we exist in this world, right? And, I talk all the time with students and I'm like, go sit at the grocery store, right? And just watch how many people are coming out with cases of alcohol or excessive, junk food or whatever it may be, looking for ways to avoid trauma and avoid dealing with it, because it's something that we're not really well versed in communicating about.
Oh, absolutely. And there's shame about talking about your trauma. And then there's internalized shame. So even if you don't tell anyone, you're experiencing it. You feel shameful. Was this my responsibility? Was this my fault? Could I have done something differently? And to your point about the connection, when I was running women's residential treatment programs, practically 100% of them, when you talked with them, had childhood, generally sexual trauma.
Right. Yeah.
And they're in a treatment center for a very high level drug or alcohol substance use disorder.
Absolutely.
And of course, co-occurring mental health issues and all, not just that. So, and I would say, I would even go less extreme. We have trouble just sitting with negative or difficult feelings.
Oh, absolutely.
Even early, even significantly less intense than trauma. And so instead of sort of sitting with those feelings for a minute, I feel angry. I feel this feeling towards someone that I'm not comfortable with, whatever it is, we go to the smart food and the
Right.
smartphone or the snacks.
I think from my own experience, that was the biggest moment of enlightenment, is to become aware that that's what I was doing. And I had a really significant event happen. So I have talked a lot about, I have an addiction to food, and I've struggled with that for a very long period of my life. And over the last 2.5 years, I actually lost 155 pounds. An interaction that I had with an individual that I did not know
Oh.
that caused me to become aware that I had an addiction. So I had a negative interaction with an individual at a store. They were intoxicated, and my existence there was just something that they, didn't like or whatever. And they made comments to me, and they actually shamed me for my weight. And immediately I was terrified, right? Because the unpredictability of people and things like that. But I went home and I immediately wanted to go and eat.
Right.
And it never occurred to me until that moment. And then I became aware in that moment, whoa, I was just triggered, and I'm able to identify that I'm triggered.
Right.
And now I'm asking myself to engage in this maladaptive behavior. And as I started to reflect on it, I thought back, and every single time I had that uncomfortable feeling, that's what I would do.
Right.
And I will tell you, people have asked me, well, how did you lose weight? I healed trauma, right? I didn't heal all of my trauma, right? I'm not unbroken, right? I'm not fixed. I identified that maladaptive behavior that was in response to whatever event that initiated that, right? And I'm able to stop it, right? But I still struggle all the time. And I think that people don't have that awareness.
We discuss it in class a lot in terms of maladaptive coping. People will have stress, anxiety, trauma, negative feelings, whatever it is. And how do you cope? Do you cope by going home and, like you said, having that 6-pack of beer? Do you go home and take it out on someone else at home?
Right.
There's a lot of maladaptive coping skills. Unfortunately, some of the ones we're talking about are habitual and can change your brain and can become, physically dependent and all of that. Or do you say, you know what, I had a stressful day, I need to take a walk.
Right.
I need to, do some mindfulness if that's in your practice, whatever it might be. But you're right, we don't have a lot of intentionality or taking a break.
Yeah, and I think intentionality is really, really important, because one, it's not something that it's, kind of communicated to us to do, right? Most of the time you hear people say, they're like, just get over it, right? Push it away. So that's where that escape culture comes from, and the avoidant culture, because we're constantly communicating not only to ourselves, but to other people to avoid it, just to get over it. Right.
And sort of speaking to that avoidance, I like that you brought up smartphones. I'm noticing more and more the people that are in my life and that I follow on social media are taking a break from social media because it's not giving them the same effect that they want it to anymore. It's that I think it's something that I have to come to terms with, that I definitely struggle with, of, opening my main source is Twitter for that dopamine hit, and then reading all of these miserable things and realizing, okay, well, I have to scroll a little more to get to what I want to see, to give me more happiness than this miserable news is giving me. And suddenly it's 4 a.m. and I'm still scrolling, waiting for that dopamine boost that's not coming.
And I like that you brought up dopamine, but I also want to talk about, this chasing the first high. It's never the same. Yep. Right. And I use an example of a baby eating ice cream for the first time. Right. And I don't know if you've seen the video of the little kid who eats it, and she grabs it and she holds onto it. Right. And that to me is the perfect example of people's interaction, their first interaction with drugs or substances, right? Food, right? an Oreo is never going to taste as good as the first time you've ever had it, right?
Yeah.
And it's because of dopamine, right? It's because that dopamine rush that you're getting, it's like that first, right? And it's new. And once you get desensitized to it, right? And so the more and more you use this substance, the more and more you're having to, kind of look for alternative ways, right? We hear a lot of people talk about, cannabis being a gateway drug. And there's a lot of research that says, well, this is not true, right? But for me, on an individual level, I don't necessarily think that cannabis is a gateway drug in the sense that it, causes you to use other drugs. I think it's an informal thing, right? So you've been desensitized to it, right? And now you need to find something that will give you that first high again. And the only thing that can do that is a new substance, right? And so I do see it as that because it's such a social drug now that it's socially acceptable. It's not like I'm walking around saying, oh yeah, you want some crack? Here, I'll do some crack, right? Like that, the reaction that you just gave me, right, shows the way that our culture views those two things, right? There's so much, like, if you use crack, like, you have a serious problem, right? But if you smoke cannabis, no big deal, right? And so I think in that sense, like, we kind of like get our feet wet a little bit with drugs, right? It used to be nicotine, right? It used to be like, oh, that's kind of like, oh, you want to try a cigarette, right? And now it's like less socially acceptable to smoke cigarettes. Now people are doing the vaping or whatever, but it is a pathway.
Right, because your body, obviously is set up to create a tolerance. So you get a tolerance. And as you said, for some people, that's okay because they're at that level of comfortability, whatever it is. And for other people, they need more dopamine or they need more, they have sensation seeking, or those negative feelings are still creeping through.
Right.
So
it's not powerful enough.
Right. So it's like, oh, I was feeling anxious and I was able to, smoke pot and now I'm not anxious, but now it's starting to come back. So I need to do something more.
Yeah. And the same thing happens, I think, with all other substances,
right?
Whatever it may be. Like you talk about doom scrolling, right? So like you're looking for more and you're looking for more and more and more. Your point about tolerance too. It's, like this is where individuals vary, I think, because a lot of people are like, oh, I can never do that. Or I've never been addicted to drugs, right? I've used drugs, but I've never been addicted. Those people, like, they've got problems, right? But it's more about brain chemistry, right? Because like
we're finding that out more and more all the time.
Absolutely. Like, and I tell people all the time, like, it's not generally socially acceptable for people to say I'm addicted to food or I have a food addiction, right? Most people are like,
uncomfortable with that.
They don't think it's real.
Yeah, it's not real. Like, what?
Why are you sharing that?
Yeah, like,
okay.
Why is that relevant? Like, we all eat food, right? Or like, and it's because we've kind of categorized addiction, right? And it's that you can only be addicted to these things that we've deviantized, right? And well, I mean, food everybody needs, and like even sex addiction is difficult for people to like. Oh, I'm a sex addict, and it's like, what? Absolutely. Or, I'm addicted to gambling. But at the root of all of that is brain chemistry. And we're talking about different individuals' brain chemistry. And, for me, like, if I eat a cupcake or a cookie, like, I want 85 of those, right? And, like, oh, well, this food was very good and it gave me enough dopamine. Like, I want more, right? But, like, to smoke a cigarette, it does nothing for me, right? And so the variation in who gets addicted to what and how significantly really lies in our brain chemistry. And I don't think we have enough information out there about that.
No, absolutely not. I've told the students, like, I've become this little like neuroscience nerd on the side. Like, I don't understand all of it, but I understand enough to know things like some of us are born with less opioid receptors, morphine receptors in your brain. So you're going to have a different reaction to opioids. The other thing is metabolism. how you metabolize
Right.
food or beverages. Even certain ethnicities have a tendency to metabolize things not as quickly. So that leads to dependence. So there's a lot of things physically,
Mhm.
like you said, primarily it's a, brain disorder, but there's a lot of
Yeah.
things in the body that are going to make your experience a little bit different than mine.
And I like that you bring up dependence, because I think that there is an important conversation. So there's a psychological aspect to this and a physiological aspect.
Mhm.
And I think people struggle with understanding, right?
Mhm.
Because, our body can become dependent on something. And that's one type of dependence. But our minds can become dependent on that. And that's a different type,
Mhm.
right?
And then when you put them together, the power of that,
Mhm.
because we're talking about trauma and dealing with emotionality, and maybe that's why you begin taking a drug or maybe even continue. But then you get to a point, if you're physically dependent, where you're fearful to stop that because
Mhm.
of the withdrawal.
Mhm.
And we have withdrawal even with behavioral things. If you, Lauren, or if you put your phone down for a day, my guess is if you come back and report on it, you'll be like a little irritable or a little anxious or feel some kind of negative way.
Yeah, I think that's one thing when I realized, like, okay, maybe this is a bit of an issue, is everyone, like all of my friends saying to me, how do you know these things before we do? Like, how are you so up to date? How do you know all these things? And it's because my brain never stops. So I think if I were to put it down, I would be irritable because I would be itching to know what I am missing.
There you go.
Yeah. There's an uncomfortability, right? And I think that that's really the root. There's an uncomfortability when we withdraw that substance. We are uncomfortable
Mhm.
and we have a hard time articulating what that actually is. And so we go back to where can we go to not feel uncomfortable anymore? But you bring up something else that the behavioral, right? And I think that we also don't engage with this idea of a behavioral dependence, right? So I know for people that have smoked, they have a really hard time because that becomes so much a part of their behavioral mechanism, right? So they go outside and they're sitting there spending 10 minutes with themselves,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And they're engaging in this physical behavior that they're doing back and forth. And now, well, you're asking me, and I do that 15 times a day, whatever.
Yeah.
So now you're asking me to not do that. So then when do I get self-reflection? When do I get that personal time away with myself? What do I do with my hands? A lot of smokers you'll hear, what do I do with my hands,
Mhm.
And people say, oh, well, chew gum. And it's like, wait, what? Hands,
With
gum,
my hands,
what?
yeah.
Like I'm
Well,
confused.
and even I would even add to that you're taking deep breaths. They're not, the healthiest deep breaths, but you're doing it in a way that other people aren't,
And that's like a form of mindfulness practice,
yes,
right?
exactly. So,
Yeah.
I would, if I'm talking to someone in that situation, that's what I would be incorporating, would be some mindfulness. But yeah, when you just take something away, it's a good example that you're using of like, well, now don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
You have to have something else.
Mhm.
I also want to go back to what you said about uncomfortability, because I think that's huge. And I think we don't have a mechanism where we teach our kids or anyone in our culture how to sit with being uncomfortable, how to even define what that is. I try to talk to my kids about like, what are you feeling in your body? Where are you feeling this feeling? And what does it feel like? And, we just know like mad, sad,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Like I have that conversation a lot with people is there's only like 3 acceptable emotions or emotions that we actually communicate about. Like you can be happy, you can be sad, you can be angry, and angry is not an acceptable emotion ever. And of course, like I tell people, no, anger is the part of you that's saying this is wrong and it's standing up for you, right? But we have to allow, acknowledge, accept. Right. And we don't converse. We say suppress. Right. And then there are only 2 acceptable emotions. You're either, happy or you're sad. And while we recognize that you might be angry at times, we don't talk about it and you need to go get yourself under control. Right. You're out of control. And I find that so perplexing when people are angry and they're like, you're out of control. And it's like, because I'm not happy, I'm out of control. right?
Right.
But there's a feelings wheel.
Oh, there's so many feelings.
It's huge, and it's even it even works your way out, right? Like we have these core emotions,
Yep.
right? And those emotions are rooted in much deeper feeling, right? That expands outward, that really can get to the root of what's going on. And you tell anybody, oh, there's a complex array of feelings, and they're like, what? And they're rooted in these really like deep internalized things that are rooted in maybe experience or culture or whatever it might be. And people they don't have the language to communicate about this. And so we've very much created this culture of avoidance, of escapism. And it's only expected that we are a culture are a culture of addicts. I don't think I could tell you anybody who's free from some type of addiction, but you mentioned uncomfortability. And I think that, with my kids, I hear them all the time. They're like, I'm bored. And I'm like, you're uncomfortable with that. Right. And they're like, well, yeah, I don't like this feeling. And I'm like, do you think that boredom is a feeling? I'm like, is that a feeling? Right. And I'm like, really, I think it's not necessarily boredom, but it's a longing, right? It's a lack of stimulation. There is something like your brain needs something, right? Our brains need stimulation. And I tell this all the time. They need stimulation. It needs variety. Right? Like if you ever find yourself just sitting at the computer doing one thing for forever and you just get so exhausted. Like your brain needs variety. Like, why do you think we tell ourselves dreams at night?
Right.
Our brains get bored, right?
Yep.
And they need that variation, right? Yep. And to make sense of things. But, like I tell them that like when I was a kid, I'm like, boredom didn't really exist.
You just make something up.
Yeah. I'm like, I went and sat on a blanket and looked at the sky. I listened to music. I went for a walk or a bike ride. I wrote. I dreamed. Right. And I think that, where we're moving in with technology, it's a killer of creativity and innovation, but it's also really fueling addiction.
Yes.
In significant ways with that instantaneous connection and instantaneous dopamine rushes. It's never enough, right? Those short form, like you get on a rabbit hole and it's 4:00 in the morning and you're like, where the hell did my life go?
Yeah.
Right. It's a time suck. Right. And it steals. And I think for me, that's what drugs and substances do. They steal.
What's interesting is, we were talking about like chasing the high. So much of what you experience after the beginning of, like you said, that endorphin, the neurotransmitters getting excited is actually numbing. It's really not feeling much of anything. It's a lack of, it's either suppressing the negative feelings or aiming for something that you don't really get anymore.
And it also shuts down your ability to even feel, right? I know that with a lot of individuals that have struggled with addiction, they report that, like, I just can't feel anything. And it really, they struggle to reactivate those feeling systems. And so then it's a really difficult place to be when you're trying to fight an addiction because you've been just numbing. And now all of a sudden you're struggling to even feel.
And some of that goes back to the brain chemistry we were talking about. Sometimes literally your brain says, oh, you're getting your dopamine somewhere else. I don't need to produce the normal amounts of dopamine. And then if you do, go into a recovery state, your brain isn't creating it for you. And if someone is already struggling, it's a very difficult experience to not feel that.
Yeah, and I think it's growing with our culture being so focused on instantaneous information, right? So like that short form video that you're getting that constant and like that instant gratification. And so, there's a lot of people that I hear talk about their attention spans are shrinking and they're struggling to pay attention. And so we're looking for, oh, okay, well, I quit using drugs, so now I should be all better.
Right. Unfortunately, no. And I think that's really important when I've worked with people to make sure people understand if you are getting rid of a dependence or a negative habit or a numbing, what are you going to do with that time? How are you going to manage the feelings? And to have a reasonable expectation that it's going to suck at first.
Yeah.
It's not going to be good because you're either going to have to handle those traumatic or uncomfortable feelings that you weren't handling, or you're going to have things like less dopamine. You know, you're going to have, what do I do with my hands? You know, there's a
Yeah.
lot of things. So making sure people have a reasonable expectation, because that can help them to not relapse. Like, this is normal. It sucks,
Yeah.
but it's normal.
Because like what you were saying about there being so many emotions and only certain few being acceptable, people who are coming off of that and experiencing that discomfort because we don't talk about it, it feels so wrong that they will then want to turn back to the thing that was originally giving them that stimulus.
Yeah.
And it's just that endless cycle of
Absolutely, yeah. And I was reflecting as you were talking about unrealistic expectations, right? And one of the things that I think that we struggle with is, you know, like they'll say, you know, I've been clean for X number of days and then I relapsed, and, you know, like I've failed.
Mhm.
And, you know, it's really frustrating because we forget to look at our successes, right? All of the days that we did well. And one of the things for me about, you know, just trying to, you know, heal, it was really hard because diets are restrictive, right? And exclusive.
Mhm.
And I love cooking and baking. That's like my love language, right? And so then whenever I would go on a diet, right? And it was like, no sugar, no this. And like, I wasn't able to really engage in something that was so much a part of who I was that it was never successful, right?
Mhm.
And so whenever I started really getting on this path of healing, I recognized like I cannot exclude anything. I can't say I'm not eating sweets, I'm not eating this or whatever.
Mhm.
And so I had to really find a way that I was able to still enjoy the cooking and baking that I love, but manage it in a way that supported my goals and my needs, right?
Mhm.
And so I've fortunately been able to create that system for myself, and I do things like promote some things over others. So I don't restrict it. I just say this is more important that I eat. I can still have this.
Mhm.
But then also finding ways to modify, rather than eating things that have sugar, I can eat things that are sweet that don't necessarily have all of that added sugar, right? And so it's I think it's challenging for anyone going through recovery, right? I think it's more challenging, and I don't want to quantify, right? But I think it's difficult when you're talking about illicit drugs, because how do you modify use,
Right.
right, in those healthy ways? And how do you get the needs that you have met
Mhm.
while still not using these things? And so it becomes difficult to adopt like a non-restrictive, right? You do
Right.
have to exclude, right? It's a little bit easier to figure out, I guess, when it's something that isn't an illegal drug.
Well, and I think you could frame it either way, because I think there are people, I've worked with, you know, a lot of people, and they, like, say someone who was using meth and they completely come off of it and they're in recovery and they're doing well. Meth doesn't have to be a part of their life. Obviously, that's incredibly difficult, but food will always be part of your life. So it is a challenging balance because,
Yeah.
you know, so
Yeah.
but I think anytime you have a deprivation model, you have to be careful. Even with drugs,
Mhm.
the people who do well usually start from like this isn't good for me, I can't do this anymore, but move into a more positive, like, I feel better when I'm not doing this, or I'm coping with it in this way. Because if you're constantly, like, you know, if you're thinking, that drug was really fun, but I know I can't do it, that's not sustainable. You're not going to
Right.
do that.
You have to kind of like evolve your thinking about it
Yes.
in a way that it's unhealthy. I did that with exercise. Like I used to tell people like I'm allergic to exercise. I sweat and my heart pounds and like I don't feel well, right? And now I have gotten to the place where I'm framing it like I feel better when
Exactly.
I exercise, and I need to do this so I can have a cupcake. You know, like
Yeah.
and I have a much more positive outlook on exercise, which has helped me be more successful. But then also with food, I don't use it as a means to fill an emptiness. I eat with purpose. And then, so I do fasting and things like that, which helps me to maintain control. Food isn't always an open choice for me to just go and pull from, right? There are these periods of time where, like, okay, this is when I'm going to consume food, right? So I'm very mindful of and intentional about utilizing it. I've heard people with addiction talk about what I consider replacement, right? So I'm not going to use meth, but pot's okay, right? So they replace it, or I'm not going to smoke pot. I'm going to just, I'll drink a couple of beers here and there. And to me, that's just replacement. It's not really doing anything to work at healing the root of why you need a substance.
Right. So I think I look at it two different ways. I agree that if you're not looking at the root, then you're not really healing and you're not really getting to a place of recovery. I'm definitely not opposed to harm reduction models, though, from the standpoint of, like I say in class, we were talking about fentanyl before we started. That is a scary, scary drug, and people are dying. For example, with my own teenagers, I don't want them to use fentanyl, but I gave them fentanyl testing strips and Narcan because I don't want them using it, but I also would like them to not die. Right. So if someone is on meth and they step down to pot, I agree that they may not have addressed the root issues, which we would love, but they're in a lot less
safer.
Danger.
Yeah.
They're in a lot less danger. And honestly, that's a real evolution of my opinion, because when I started at 26 or whatever, working in treatment, it was abstinence based. It was, you don't use anything. It was, but over time, sometimes that's what people would have to do to get where they ultimately need to be. So even if it is a replacement, we can't really argue, it is, but maybe it's part of their process or their step to get where they need to go.
I agree. Like, harm reduction is a positive step forward. I think that I'm a little idealistic in, hoping that people can be abstinent from it, just because of not just my personal experience, but, what I've witnessed for the people around me, because largely drugs have stolen a lot from me on a personal level. And, I kind of I have beef with drugs.
Yeah.
With substances.
Yeah.
We've got issues, and I don't like you.
Yep.
And, we've got problems, we need to talk about these things. And I think on a personal level, I see what it's stealing from the individual.
Oh yeah.
And I want them to have their life back, because I know what that feels like to have your life back.
I mean, I worked with people in the throes of their addiction for 10 years. Talk about frustrate. Like, you just want to shake the person, but at the same time, you have to look at where they're coming from, meet them where they're at. How can I help? But yeah, it can be absolutely infuriating.
It's devastating.
And I've lost a lot of people that way as well. So if there was a harm reduction model that would help them, if it's opioids and they can take an opioid antagonist like methadone maintenance, or I used to be very against that in my youth, and now I'm like, but they'll be alive. Yeah. And then we can hopefully help them to get to some of the more idealistic places you're talking about that I fully support as well.
It's a disheartening cycle, I think, because on the one hand, it's extremely frustrating because we see as outsiders what it's stealing from individuals. But on the other hand, we recognize the uncomfortability of the uncomfortability,
Mm-hmm.
right? And, you know, it's my hope that we can really bring awareness to trauma and make it a household conversation where we're having these conversations in classrooms and in hospital waiting rooms and doctors' offices and, you know, offices everywhere, so that we can really start educating everyone about our adverse experiences, right? And how they shape this avoidance that we have taken part in. And we're really on kind of a Ferris wheel of what, you know, like we're just all on it and we don't know how to get off, and it's just not stopping. And it's going to take intentionality. It's going to take mindfulness and self-awareness, because it is a very, very challenging place to be. And I think it's easy for outsiders that don't have experience with it to place a lot of judgment and shame. But I think that when we begin to take an inventory and say, what am I doing?
Yes.
Right?
Right.
Because I think that we all, like I said earlier, we all are participating in this. There are things, there are conversations that I avoid all of the time. And while I'm able to stay away from substances to numb that, right, I'm still avoiding.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Shutting down, using other ways of avoiding that. We just really are having a difficult time as a species, really, and a culture, engaging with the emotional.
And are we raising generations that are avoidant in whole new ways that aren't looked at the same way? So you know, or your friends learn being on your phone. No one, I mean, yes, us old folks might be like, oh, always on their phone.
Screenagers,
But
yeah.
screenagers. But, you know, it's not something that is shamed like, you know, that drug addict. But it's almost all, you know, I mean, my youngest is 13. Gaming, you know, is such a huge deal. That's a lot of their social interaction is online. So are we going to have a whole generation that is in some way addicted, dependent on devices, on gaming, on, you know, gambling online, and, you know, sports betting is getting worse and worse.
Porn consumption is,
yes.
And I think that so this conversation about technology and the use of technology among younger generations is a conversation that we're having all of the time. But one conversation, and it's utilized to avoid and to numb. But one conversation I don't think that we even recognize as the same thing is if we reflect back on older generation and their consumption of news media, right? It definitely impacts their views about the world and their behaviors. I remember, like, my dad, 5, 6, 7, 11, like he's watching TV, like that's where I could find him at those times, right? And it was compulsive. Like, and he owned a business and he had a TV on all the time. All the time. The only time it was off is when he was at home. And guess what? When he was at home, the TV was on. And there were times where the TV was even on when he was asleep, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so older generations were struggling with this constant flow of information. It was just packaged differently, right?
That's true.
And it might have came in slower forms, but it really was something that was shaping their lives and their experiences. And in similar ways, I think, to the younger generation's consumption, it's packaged differently.
Yeah.
But it was really, it really was like a way to escape. And I think if you remember, like, the conversations, like, these were like all revolving around where they got, like, what's the weather and what's going on in the world and, you know, who's the latest, right? And it was always just these very superficial things, right? We didn't engage in deep level conversations that were about complex emotional things. We stayed right on the surface.
Mhm.
And it's much like the way that you're consuming information. You're staying right on the surface.
Yeah, and I think we talk about, social aspects that turn people to substances like that. We think about people my age and people just a few years younger than me spent formative years all trapped indoors, only experiencing things through the internet during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think spending really formative years all online and then to have that immediately stripped away from you and having you expected
now
to now
engage.
engage
Yeah.
in real life and not through a headset or through Zoom or whatever. It's entirely different, and it's an entirely different set of skills that a lot of kids my age and younger just didn't have time to develop.
Yes. Talk about uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also you bring up a point about some of the challenges that the younger generations are dealing with, and that is communicating. Like we are a disconnected, connected world, right? We've never been more connected, but we've never been more disconnected. And I think the younger generations, especially the ones that went through COVID, are really struggling on communicating, right? In these, really like conversational ways. And so it's very easy for them to turn to technology to fill that uncomfortability, right?
Well, and it's interesting. I'm glad that you brought up disconnection because that's actually in certain discussions and circles, a synonym for addiction is disconnection.
Yeah.
And there's like when they do studies with rats, and the rat will always go over and push on the button that will give them an opiate, right? But I've heard really, really smart people talk about, but the rat is isolated. What if you put the rat in with family and with baby rats, they don't go over to that as much, So how do we make sure that people have more connection, and what effect does that have on not doing these, substances or other behaviors for numbing?
That was a great analogy to what occurs in trauma. Trauma is a disconnection, right? And I'm not sure if you're familiar with The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah.
And, Vanderkolk, he talks about really trauma is not so much the experience, but it's about what happens within you,
Exactly.
right? And that we as humans need connection. More than anything else, we need connection. And when we experience things, it's not that things are traumatic. It's that we are alone in that experience that causes trauma, right? And so I think that is a perfect analogy for really what is fueling addiction because of its connection to this traumatic experience, because we were alienated.
Right.
We were disconnected.
So imagine if I experience sexual trauma at a young age and I go to mom and she says, no, that didn't happen, or you did something wrong, as opposed to if I go to mom or another trusted adult and they say, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I should have protected you. Let me take care of you. What do you need? Right? But we often hear the first one, or you don't even feel comfortable telling someone about it at all.
And when I read The Body Keeps the Score, and I read that, it answered every question that I had about my own experiences, because when I reflect back, everything that I would consider traumatic in my life, I was alone, right? There was no communication or conversation with anyone about this. Even though people were aware of this, I was still disconnected and alone. And, I developed a really good skill of communicating with myself. And, it's not the same, right? And it can lead you to a very, very dark places, especially like you get in a rabbit hole in your own head, right?
And that's so much where shame comes from, because shame lives in darkness, in silence. And that is also, I believe, heavily rooted with addictive behaviors, because a person, instead of feeling like this terrible thing happened to me, or this person did this thing to me, or whatever it might be, thinks there's something wrong with me.
Absolutely.
And that's how they walk through the world.
He points out that children who are victims of parental abuse, who are abused by their parents, they don't learn to hate their parents. They learn to hate themselves. And, I think on a personal level, that was pivotal for me. And one of the things that was like the most freeing is to hear that. But I think that for individuals who are experiencing or going through addiction, shame is huge in a lot of respects. One, it's probably one of the reasons that they're looking for some way to numb.
Mm-hmm.
But then once they use substances, they feel more shame.
Oh, it's a terrible cycle. They feel shame about the use. They might feel shame about things that they do in that. An
Absolutely.
example I use a lot it's terrible, but, I would have moms who, like I had a mom who relapsed and wasn't in treatment when her child came for their like court appointed visit. So now she comes back and she feels shame. She already was, of course, experiencing shame using drugs, and now she has shame from that experience. Well, what does her instinct tell her? Does it say, okay, I'm going to sit and reflect on this, how I feel about it and work on it, or I'm going to go get high because I can't feel this?
Absolutely, because that's the way that our culture has trained us as humans. It's to avoid, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not to self-reflect. It's not about awareness. It's not about engaging with our emotions or being cognizant of that. And there's no grace or compassion that we're taught to have for ourselves. It's very much shut down, avoid, escape at all cost. And so it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
This is the way we're trained, right? How do we get out of this cycle, right? We've got to start, I think, with education, right? And having those conversations, having conversations like this, where we engage in understanding our experiences and what is impacting the way that we adapt to those experiences, and the role of trauma and shame and avoidance and just self-awareness, so that we can kind of get to that place. And for me, on a personal level, I think that this is the root of where drug treatment, addiction treatment should be rooted in, right? Along with helping people fight their addiction. But we really have to be more purposeful about educating.
And I think for me, I would be remiss in this conversation if I didn't bring up vulnerability. I know I personally, and I think you're like this as well, I share and I'm vulnerable in my classes and with people in my life, and people, that resonates with people and they feel more comfortable being vulnerable back. But that's rare.
Oh, I agree. Yeah.
We armor up, we want to act tough or make rationalizations or defend, instead of like, yeah, I messed up, or I'm struggling, or I'm hurting, or whatever vulnerable, messages. That, I think that's a big thing. If we could have more vulnerability, and, I've tried to, I guess, I feel like my little way that I try to change society is between teaching and parenting, or my own
I
experience.
agree. Absolutely. Like those are two avenues where I am planting seeds.
Right.
And,
always planting
and
seeds.
watering those seeds, and hoping that you come along and you water those seeds too. And I think that with vulnerability comes authenticity.
Exactly.
And, like my kids, they're asking me all the time. They're like, why do your students like talking to you so much? And as they're sitting in my office at home in my chair, and I'm like, I look over and I'm like, why do you think you're sitting right there? When you have all kinds of other things? And they're like, I mean, I just like being around you. And I'm like, well, I think that's how they feel.
Right.
And we had this conversation in class today. I think that when we are vulnerable and when we're authentic, we're deconstructing power structures that really allow other people to be vulnerable and authentic. And really, to me, the best explanation for that process is a deep exhale.
Oh yeah.
People are able to just be like,
I don't
I
have
can
to
just
put on an act. I don't have to
be.
be a certain way.
And we all three talked about, before we started rolling, that we use humor as a way of expressing that. And I think even if it's humorous, it doesn't make it any less authentic
Right.
and any less vulnerable. And I think even it makes situations like this less daunting to talk about.
Mhm.
And it adds that comfort for other people to
Yeah.
feel like they can come to you or any of us with issues and really feel comfortable expressing those because we're authentic in our own like comfortable way.
Yeah, and with humor, I think you can see like we acknowledge the absurdity of this.
Yes.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
to say that, like to have a conversation about drugs, we have experienced this type of addiction or whatever, and to be comical with it, it really creates a comfortability that we can have a conversation. And I think it creates a safety.
Yes.
There's
Right.
a lack of judgment there. It's like, hey, we can
Absolutely.
joke about this. I'm not judging you for who you are or what you're going through.
Right.
You can feel safe.
Yeah. And I think that's difficult. And I think that, like you said, we need more of that.
Yeah.
We need more conversations about how we can feel, how we do feel, how we can exist. Because as you said earlier, like there's a disconnect, right? When we're not authentic and we're not vulnerable,
Mhm.
then like you said, we're putting on a mask, we're putting on this armor, and we don't get to be our real selves. And so then we walk away from those situations not refreshed. We walk away exhausted. Right. And it's like, and then we have to continue to engage and like put on our customer service voice.
Yes.
We have to continue to
Every
do
day.
that, right?
Yeah.
It's like, what are the expectations of me? And then I have to just perform in that way. And I think that that's part of the challenge within our culture is we are avoiding vulnerability and authenticity so much so that we're numbing ourselves because, well, we can't be real. We're not accepted. We're judged. We can't be who we are. So, like and it's difficult to do that. So we need help.
Right. It's instead of just walking through the world as who you are, you're walking through the world with the different masks or carrying, whatever it is you need to play that role. And I think maybe we have a little more freedom of that in academia, but like just in the work, obviously if you're working in for profits, you have all the roles you have to play for that. I mean, there's all these
They have the
different roles.
stakeholders.
Yeah.
Yeah. They don't have that freedom and that liberty, and even in the world, like when you go to the
Just in the
grocery
world.
store, right? There's an expectation for how you're going to exist, like what you're supposed to wear and how you're supposed to carry yourself. And like, if I wanted to go get some milk at, 8:00 in the morning and I didn't want to get dressed, well, people are going to judge me if I wear my robe or something. And like, there's always that judgment, right? And so we live in fear of being judged and being harmed and disconnected. And so that's where all of this kind of, fear of being vulnerable and this uncomfortability comes from. And so I say all the time, like, I understand why people are addicted.
Yeah.
Like, I understand why people get addicted to things.
Well, and that just kind of hit me when you said being harmed, because I think when we hear like being judged, it almost like yeah, people judge people, but when like you think about like if I go out and whatever, if I saw you at the grocery store and I'm in my jammy pants, which could definitely happen, if you were sort of like looking, that would hurt.
It does. And
It hurts.
We only talk about harm in a tangible physical way,
Mhm.
right? But I think that the more profound harm is that very internal harm, right? Just the fact that you thought something of me that I don't think of myself, right? Because we're always looking for that mirroring, right? Just do I exist in the way that you think I exist? And so the second that we let somebody down,
Yes.
right? And so for me, harm is a much more like intrinsic, intangible thing. I mean, I am fearful of physical harm, like don't get me wrong, but like the likelihood of that to me, while it exists, like, if it's the subtleties, the little things that I think are very, very impactful for humans. And we don't acknowledge it, engage it, because we tell people to get over it.
Right. Or we say, oh, that shouldn't bother me.
Exactly.
If something
shoulds.
bothers you, it bothers you. There's no should about it.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. It leads me to an example, like growing up with my mother. Like I am a feeling being, right? And that to me is not a foreign thing, but to say that sounds foreign for people. They're like, what? You're a feeling being? Like, isn't everybody or whatever? But I am a feeling being, and I've been that way my entire life, as you should. Maybe.
I agree.
But I would share feelings with my mother, right? And she would say, well, you shouldn't feel that way. I've never felt that way. I don't feel that way.
Oh, geez.
Right? And so in those moments,
Right.
I was othered, right? And it was just like, I felt it, even when I said it, I felt it right there. Like that was a knife, like, right?
I had a mentor who was in recovery, and he was amazing especially when I was first working in treatment. And he would say, you're shooting all over yourself. And it was the best thing, like why? And I don't think I do. I try very hard not to ever do that with my kids. Like if that's how you feel, that's how you feel. How are we going to behave? That's a different thing. But your feelings, I don't think can really be wrong.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Like, and we don't communicate that feelings are valid, period. And the duality, right, of not just feelings, but the way that people exist and experiences. Two people going into the same interaction could come out of it with very different experiences, and they're both valid, right?
Just like trauma.
Absolutely.
Yep.
The validity of those things. And so I think that for me, when we engage in this idea of drugs and understanding the use of drugs and the abuse of drugs, it has to be contextualized in the culture that we exist within to understand that, one, we've created a culture of avoidance, and two, we have shamed every part of the other end of that spectrum, which is the feeling end, right? So much so that the only choice that we as individuals have is to avoid. And the difficulties with that avoidance almost entirely relies on this idea that we need a substance, whatever that substance is. And so, to say that, you just have to get over it, I think is an unrealistic expectation.
Maybe even harmful.
Absolutely. Well, thank y'all for coming today and talking with me about drugs. This is Justice Talks. This is the podcast where we talk about using trauma-informed practices to ensure criminal justice reform.